If I believe there's a reason for this pain I'm going through, if I believe that leaving me was all that you could do, if I believe that I can feel you by my side, I'll make it through the night. If I believe that time will teach me how to find my way, if I believe that broken hearts grow stronger every day, if I believe that now you're dancing across the sky, I just might get by. I believe that memories won't always hurt this much, if I believe that I will see your face again, I can wait till then. If I believe I'll hold you in my arms again, I can wait. I know that I can wait. I can wait till then. I can wait till then.
That's where they can watch you.
Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Joanne Riccio, and welcome to the Somerville Overcoming Addiction show. Tonight's guest is my co-host, well, it seems like he's my co-host, Bob McWatters. And of course, you know that he's a former probation officer.
Former probation officer.
And we have our guest tonight, our special guest is Kevin Sheehan. And he is a probation officer, still.
Still.
Looking at retirement yet?
6 years.
Oh.
But who's counting?
I am next year.
All right, good for you.
I have to say, Joanne, in all my service in the system, first of all, I want to thank Kevin for coming on tonight. He's a friend and a colleague. But anytime we had training in the system, I always made sure on addiction, I'd go to Kevin's training because, in my opinion, an absolute expert, knows addiction cold. He knows, I mean, he's, to me, he's like a teacher. He's been through it. He gets it. And I think he's a real asset, not only in the probate court in Cambridge, but I think for the probation system in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I want to thank him for coming on. And if we can, I'd like to ask him a little bit about his background, why he got interested in probation, but before that, what were some of the issues that he had to go through and struggles he had in his life. And I think it's important for people to know he's been there and done it, and he's had struggles, and he's a better man now for it. And now, that's why, in my opinion, if he's out there teaching a seminar or a training, by all means go, because you're not going to learn any more from anyone else. So, Kevin, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thank you, Bobby. So like Bob and Joanne said, my name is Kevin Sheehan. I'm a probation officer at the Middlesex Probate and Family Court. I'm also a licensed drug and alcohol counselor and a recovering addict. So my story, you know, I was afraid of drugs and alcohol. I had a cousin who died of a Valium overdose. Valiums were big in the 60s. Died of a Valium overdose, and it scared the hell out of me. I grew up in an alcoholic home, so alcohol scared me. And I never really got into anything until I was 17 years old. I'd never had my first drink until I was 17. I was working for the Boston Red Sox. I was on the ground crew, and it was 1975, and to reward the ground crew, they would send cases of beer down after the game. And looking back, I could see now where the problem started. You know, there was probably 40 guys. You know, 32 of them went home without anything. 2 or 3 grabbed a couple to go, and there was 4 or 5 of us that hung around and drank the 3 or 4 cases of beer until it was gone. But what it did was I grew up with fear, doubt, and insecurity, low self-esteem, low self-worth, you know, growing up in an alcoholic family. Alcohol took all that away. I fell in love with it the minute I drank it, and I became alcoholic probably within 6 months. My senior year of high school, I drove a car through a house, in one side, out the other. I was so drunk that I just fell over and drove the car through a house. And I thought nothing of it. I just thought, well, okay, that happens to everybody, doesn't it? But alcohol was my initial drug of choice, and it was my initial problem. But what happened to me was, I used to be able to drink a case of beer. You know, I'd be drunk, but I could still function. And at the end of my drinking, 1 beer, I was in a blackout and I was drunk. It's what they call reverse tolerance. And so alcohol turned on me. I had to have back surgeries when I was 18. And I remember the first time I had the surgery, they sent me home. I had 2 different doctors, a neurosurgeon and an orthopedic surgeon. One preferred Demerol, one preferred Percocet. And they both preferred Valium. So I came home with 3 bottles of medications. And you know what? I only took them as prescribed because I was afraid of drugs. I probably threw half of them away. I had to have a second surgery where they had to fuse my back. And by this time, because of the first surgery, I couldn't work. I was hanging out in the streets and hanging out with people that were getting into other things such as drugs. And they sent me home the second time, and I kept asking for refill after refill after refill. And
How old were you then?
so I was 18. Because I loved the way they made me feel. I had no feelings at all. But I was hanging out with these guys that started getting into cocaine and liquid morphine and liquid Demerol. So the first narcotic other than a Percocet that I did was injectable morphine. And I loved that too. And I loved everything that went with it. So the guys I was hanging out with, you know, we had the things we were doing, we ended up with a lot of drugs, and that's what we were seeking, and that's what we did. I was living over here in Cambridge, right across from the hospital on Camellia Ave, and I had a psychotic episode on cocaine where everything was real to me. The best way I can describe it is you feel as though you're schizophrenic. You hear voices, you see people. I heard and saw people thinking they were coming to steal my cocaine. So I called the police, and I told them someone was in my house. And the sad part of that story is I did that 3 times. Finally, the 3rd time, they sent someone from Cahill 4 over, and they put me in a rubber room for a little while. But my 80-year-old grandmother, who only had 1 leg, I lived with her, and she witnessed all of this. There aren't a lot of things about my past that still haunt me because of where I'm at in my recovery. I've worked beyond it. But that's one thing that sometimes still wakes me up, to see my 80-year-old grandmother. You know, police running through the house and looking for someone that's not there. But that's what it did to me. So I stopped doing cocaine, because even if I did 1 tiny little line of cocaine, I automatically went back into a psychotic state. So that drug wasn't effective for me anymore, so I stopped using that drug. But in the meantime, I had to have 2 more back surgeries, and by this time, I'm a full-blown addict, full-blown alcoholic, and I got a Dr. Feelgood, who I think was going through midlife crisis, and he would give me 100 Percocets a week, and he did that for a year. So this was
You
19.
didn't take them, 100.
Oh, I would eat 50 at a time. Well, that's because my tolerance.
Right.
My tolerance was up at that higher level back then. It wasn't, I mean, I got high, but I also got really sick, you know.
No one in the medical field at that time ever even asked if you had an addiction.
They didn't know what addiction was.
They didn't know.
They didn't know.
Yep.
So doctors go to medical school, not so much today because they've implemented new legislation that they have to actually take a course on addiction.
Yep.
But back then, in 10 to 12 years of medical school, they get 1 hour of training on addiction. 1 hour.
Crazy.
Yeah. And so he was giving me 100 Percocets for a week for a year. And then one day
He was enhancing your addiction.
Absolutely. And I mean, he didn't even look at my back at that point. I had to have a second fusion. We went in, and like I said, I think he was going through midlife crisis. He bought a new Corvette, and he was talking about the nurses he was dating and all this stuff. And he would just say, "Here you go." He thought he was smart because he used to give me 50, and but I could call 3 days later and get 50 more. And I said, "Just write me for 100." He goes, "Oh no, that sets off red flags." But what ended up happening was they were already investigating him. And I went in one day and he said, "I can't prescribe anything anymore." And here I am with 100 perc a week habit. And I drove right over to 6th Street in Cambridge. And back then we used to go to Mission Hill. And that's when I got involved with heroin. And I did heroin for probably 15 years. Heroin took away everything from me. I mean, body-wise, I had no feelings about anything. I didn't care about you, me, or the fence post.
Did you start doing it, did you snort it at first, or did you?
I snorted it at first, but because I was familiar with intravenous use,
yep.
you know, you snort it at first, but within a week I was shooting it. And back then,
It was probably like 95 to 98% pure, not the fentanyl. And
yeah, no, it wasn't quite that high, but it was very
Significant,
potent.
yeah.
I mean, initially when you do it, you could, you know, they used to sell the glassine bags. You could do one glassine bag and be really jammed for the day.
what was your habit a day, do you know?
At the end, 20 of those glassine, 2 bundles a day.
Wow.
Yep. And back then, syringes were really hard to come by. They didn't sell them at the pharmacy. You had to find a diabetic, and you would use that syringe until it
Couldn't
broke.
use it, yeah.
I mean, we've used coat hangers to pull the plunger out because we had broken the plunger off. We used to sharpen it on matchbooks. And back then, it was a mandatory year in jail, as you remember.
Yep.
You were better off getting caught with a gun back then than a
Absolutely,
syringe. And you know, heroin was always taboo.
Right.
You know, I do presentations to children, and I'll ask them, draw me a picture of an alcoholic. And it's, you know, the guy with the trench coat and the brown bag in the doorway. And then I'll say, draw a picture of an addict. And, you know, it'll be someone in a tank top and it's 20 degrees out with long hair and no teeth. But addiction doesn't discriminate.
Nope.
You know, I grew up in a good family despite the alcoholism. We were well cared for, we were fed, we were sheltered. And once I went to heroin, it took everything away. It's a 24/7 job. You can't work, you can't do anything. And the end of my using, I didn't get high the last 6 months of my using. All you're doing is doing something so you can function.
Maintain.
Yeah, because you know, your baseline of normalcy drops, and you just need it to get back to baseline. You know, the dopamine levels. So I became a heroin addict. In the same period of time, whenever I would get in trouble, I would just move to a new state. So I lived in 5 different states, and it was just crazy. It was a crazy lifestyle. I became homeless. I've eaten out of dumpsters. I was okay sleeping in cars, park benches. So I was introduced to recovery because I overdosed. In 1990, there was some real powerful heroin, and like 7 people one of my best friends overdosed. He never got the syringe out of his arm. And, you know, when we're hanging around with other addicts, you know, they're our boys, they're my best, you know, you don't even know them, but, you know, but they got what you got, and you want what they got, and so they're your best friends. So we went up to Lowell, there were 3 of us, and I only did 2 bags, and I was used to doing 20, and I overdosed. And they drove me to a Kmart parking lot.
Just dumped you.
Dumped me, And some woman came out to have a cigarette, and she saw me laying on the ground. And back then, there wasn't Narcan like today.
Right.
You had to go to a hospital and get intravenous Narcan. So they brought me to the hospital. The whites of my eyes were fire engine red from all the blood vessels bursting. And I didn't know about detox. I didn't know about treatment. I just thought this is the life I chose. This is the way it ends for me. Because there weren't a lot of detoxes back then, either in the 90s. So they said, you know, we can offer you help if you want it. But first what happened was my mother and my sister came to the hospital and told them it was a suicide attempt. And once they heard that, they sent me to a psych unit for a 10-day
They
observation.
do that because they were ashamed, or?
No, they didn't know how to stop me from using.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that was their way of stopping me from using. So I was in Melrose Wakefield Hospital, and after a couple of days, they realized it wasn't a mental health issue, it was a substance abuse issue. My brother was
What was your withdrawal? It must have been horrible.
no, they
Medicate you,
medicated me.
Oh.
But yeah, no, my withdrawal wasn't bad at all. They medicated me, but they also realized, like, this is a substance abuse issue, and they asked me if I want help. My brother was a correctional officer at Concord State Prison, and through their EAP program, he got me into a place called Beach Hill Hospital.
Yep.
I didn't want to go. I was trying to get people to bring me drugs in the psych hospital, because in psych hospitals, they're not looking for drugs, they're looking for weapons.
Right.
And I was telling people, just stick it under the pizza. They won't even know. But nobody would. And I went up in a sheriff's department car. So I couldn't get out of the car. I was trying to figure out how to get out of the car, because Beach Hill Hospital is up in Dublin, New Hampshire.
Yes, yep.
They call it the Irish Alps.
Yep, yep.
And I couldn't get out of the car, and I'm like, I don't want to do this. And then when I got there, it was like Betty Ford. It was swimming pool, steam room, cooked to order meals, 2 people in a room with a private shower. It's not like the detoxes, you know, the public detoxes. And I got there, and I'm like, I'm doing this twice a year. This is all right. Because I still had no intentions of stopping.
Right.
I'm like, all right, I'll do this little 20, and back then you got 28 days. It's not like today where it's cut up, you got a detox holding.
Yep,
You got 28 days. So, and it was a big place. It held like 200 people. And so I started clearing up, and my mind was working again, and I started feeling better, and I started listening to the message. And from there I was moving to Vermont, because I had to get out of Massachusetts. What I didn't realize then is it wasn't the state that was the problem, because I always said, you know, it's Massachusetts, that's the problem. I didn't know at the time that wherever I went was the problem. I was the problem,
Right.
but I didn't want to acknowledge that. So they hooked me up with, they said, here's a guy in Vermont, call him when you get there, he'll take you to meetings. And I started going to meetings, and I really got into it. I was doing really well. I had a pattern of, I would get clean, start a business, get married. You know, you hear the stories of don't get away from meetings. So instead of doing the 7 meetings a week I was doing, it was down to 5. Then it was down to
4,
3.
yep.
Then it was down to 1. Then it was like, I'm too busy. I would start a business, and then I would relapse, get divorced, bankrupt the company, clean myself up again, and I've done that 3 times.
You're on your 4th marriage?
No, no. 3 was enough. Because I just didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know.
You were sick and suffering.
Well, you know what? Recovery is an internal job, and we see it all the time with people coming in. You know, they get the new car, they get the new girlfriend, you know, they got some gold, they got a decent job,
Yep.
and they forget how they got all that. And I've done that. I've made that mistake too. I was a big shot. You know, I had cars and houses and a business, and it all went away. It all went away. And they told me that anything you put before you recover, you're going to lose anyway. And I did. So I relapsed a few times early on, but you know what? I always knew where to go back. You know, sometimes you'll hear the old timers say, if you relapse, everything you learn goes out the window. Well, it's kind of like in a jury trial when the defense attorney says something that's not admissible in court, and the prosecution objects, and the judge says, disregard what you just heard.
Yep.
You can't disregard what you just heard. You heard it.
So you knew where the medicine was, and if you had to get better again, you went back.
Exactly. Yep. And but then I started working on the insides, because it's an inside job. The answers are in the 12 steps of recovery. You can go to as many open speaker meetings as you want and as many other meetings as you want, but if you don't start working on yourself, and that's what the 12 steps offered me, was it gave me an opportunity to look at myself. I didn't want to look at myself. It's much easier finding your character defects and finding your character defects than finding my own character defects. So now I do an AWOL every other year. An AWOL is an intensive 12-step meeting. We meet for like 24, 26 weeks. Just because there's new stuff coming up all the time. You're never cured from the disease of addiction. You know, people say to me, well, when are you cured? And I said, when you're dead.
Yep.
And that's when you say, geez, I never drank, I never picked up again. So I'm big on the steps. I go to 3 meetings a week. I facilitate a group with Middlesex Superior Court 1 night a week. And I never say no to opportunities to pass the message along. So I was 45 years old. I was a project manager, 45 years old, and our company got bought out by a bigger company who their project manager had more experience than me. So I was the odd man out. And I'm like, 45, what am I gonna do now? I was making 80 grand a year, and was broke. And so I was at an AA meeting, and I heard a kid talking about going back to school. He was like 32. And I was like, how do you go back to school at 32? He's like, if you show up, you get a C. Well, because
Sit in a class.
Right, because I was in recovery, I could show up today.
Yeah.
You know, one of my problems was I could never show up for anything. I missed so many things. So I took a class to see how I could do, and I got an A. And I wasn't a very good high school student. I barely got out of high school. And I got an A, and I'm like, you know what, I think I can do this. I'm gonna take 2 classes next semester. So I took 2 classes, and I got 2 more A's. So then I wanted to get into the field of recovery, and I went back to my last detox. I had 10 months clean, and I asked if I could have a job. It was Cab Health and Recovery on Mass Ave.
Yep.
And he said, well, we want you to have a year, but the recovery houses, all you need is 6 months. So he said, I'm gonna call out to the Ryan House, and I think they're looking for help. So I started at the Ryan House. I worked overnights. I had 2 young kids. My wife had a much better job than me. So I worked overnights and went to school. So after I got those 3 A's, I went full time. I took 4 classes, worked overnights. I got pretty much all A's. I got a couple of A minuses, but at the end, Bunk Hill was 2 years. So at the end of my second year, they had I got nominated for this national scholarship. I only paid for my first semester. I got scholarships the rest of the way.
Good for you.
Yeah, and that's what recovery does to you.
That's
though.
going to say the
That's what
12
it gives
steps.
you.
Yep.
So they had a national award called the New Century Scholar Coca-Cola Award. And basically what it was 2 students get nominated from each community college school in the country. In every state, there's 1 person that gets it. And it's basically the top community college student in the state of Massachusetts. And I won the award. And they flew me out to California. I got $2,000 cash. But they had a transfer scholarship. My goal was to just get my associates so I could get my license, my drug and alcohol license. But they had a transfer scholarship from Bunker Hill to UMass Boston. And
My alma mater.
and there was 1 kid ahead of me. He had a 4.0. I had like a 3.96. And at the last,
Wasn't that high?
but at the last minute, he backed out. He went to a different school. So I got the scholarship. I actually made about 10 grand going to college because back then at UMass, you only had to pay for 4 classes. And I got $5,000 a semester. So it only cost $3,200. The $1,800 I got to keep. So I went to UMass Boston and graduated from UMass Boston. And just a lot of good things happened to me with my recovery. It's hard work, though. I don't take it for granted.
You know, not to interrupt, there was one, at one of the trainings you told a great story. You're at a wedding. tells the story. He was at
Yeah.
a wedding and he was right at the bar. You tell it because
So in Pennsylvania, when you book a wedding, my cousins lived in Pennsylvania. When you book a wedding in Pennsylvania, it's open bar automatically. It's part of the package. You don't have the option. It's automatically open bar.
that's danger Will Robinson for you.
Oh yeah, it was crazy. So I went to the wedding with my first ex-wife and ended up in Texas with the bridesmaid. And I had no idea. I had no idea how I got there. I thought I woke up in a hotel room in Pennsylvania. And she said, "Oh no, we're in Texas." I'm like, "What are we doing in Texas?" She goes, "Well, I told you I had to go to Texas, and you said you'd go with me." I'm like, "Oh boy."
You didn't say that though.
No, but that explains my first ex-wife.
Oh,
But I mean,
that's the addiction.
it is the addiction. You don't care about anything or anybody. I went on a Bruins junket many years ago with a bunch of buddies of mine. Yeah, and I ended up on a couch, and I'm just looking up, and I'm like, this isn't the hotel room. And I don't know how I got there, but the bartender actually took me back to her house and put me on the couch because I didn't know where I was, and she felt bad for me. And again, I thought all those things were like normal. It's like everyone does that, don't they? Because I really did. Because you know what I thought was normal, society saw as abnormal, and vice versa.
Yeah.
I had a sponsor. I used to go to this meeting in Charlestown, and I had a sponsor, and we'd talk in the parking lot after the meeting. And after like the second time talking to him, he's looking at me kind of like a dog looks at you, and goes, "Kevin, you need to call me when you have a thought." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "You don't think normal. You don't think normal, and you're going to get in a lot of trouble." And he was right. He was absolutely right, because I saw nothing wrong with the things I was doing. Even in early sobriety, I saw nothing wrong with the things I was doing. You know, I didn't have that spiritual piece that they talk about, and I searched for it. But I was, you know, in the big book, Bill Wilson talks about, you know, the light coming through the window and the angels talking to him, and that was his, and that's what I was waiting for. But that wasn't going to happen. And I struggled with it and struggled with it, and finally an old timer said to me, he goes, "Kevin, all it means is change.
Right. Just surrender.
Surrender. Surrender. That's the spiritual part of it." And once I got that, then I could really move forward with my recovery. Until then, I was in recovery, but living outside of recovery. You know, I was still doing things I shouldn't have been doing. But once I got that piece of it, then I could really start working a program of recovery. But I had a lot of things, a lot of crazy things happen to me. And again, I just thought those things happened to everybody. I didn't know that it wasn't normal.
What is normal? I'm still trying to figure that out. I don't know what normal is.
Right, I don't think anybody does, but I just didn't know how to live on life's terms, I guess is the best way to put it. I just kind of did my own thing, and it got me in a lot of trouble. And you know, I would get in fights with bosses because they told me I had to do something, and I didn't want to. And so I would get in fights with bosses and get fired, and then it was just crazy. It was craziness. But when I was up in Vermont, the governor of Vermont at the time, so this was 20-something years ago, Howard Dean. Remember Howard Dean, the guy that ran for president?
Yes.
He was a physician by trade. He was the governor of Vermont.
Yep.
He didn't allow medication-assisted treatment. Well, back then it was just methadone.
Yeah.
He wouldn't allow methadone clinics in the state of Vermont. And I was strung out on heroin again. And up there, it's $35 for the $10 bags down here. So you got to really do some hustling. And a friend of mine told me, he says, you know, there's a study at the University of Vermont for this new drug that's going to be like an equivalent to methadone. And it was Suboxone. But we got it as buprenorphine.
Yep.
And you could make $50 a week as long as you gave clean urines. And my goal was, I got in you know, those studies are like 10 years long. And my goal was to do a 90-day and then taper on naltrexone. I did want to get off it because I had some previous recovery. I didn't want to be on it. So by the time I got on it, it was a double-blind quadruple study, which basically meant every fifth day you got a 5-day dose. and the other 4 days you got placebos. But they give it to you by weight because they're trying to figure out how much they should give
Yes.
people.
Yep.
So people my size, it would last 5 days, but people that were smaller, they were sick after 3 days. And I mean, I was high from this stuff because I'm getting a 5-day dose. But you know, the typical addict in me, I worked overnights at a trucking company, and they have graduate students that do the evaluations and the results on you, and they play dexterity games with you. They need to see what your dexterity is under the influence and all that. And they don't know any, you know, they're from Iowa or something, and they don't know anything about addiction. And I'd be falling out of my chair. And they'd be like, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, you know I work overnights."
Yeah,
And-
I'm tired.
But I was wrecked on Suboxone. So I finished I made $1,300. I finished the 90 days, and 12 hours after my first naltrax, they gave it to us as a pill. My first naltraxone dose, I was shooting heroin again because I was so sick. And then it came out later as Suboxone. And even the people I talk to today tell me they can wean down to 1 milligram, and they can't get off the 1 milligram.
That's important. You want to discuss, you know, that as part of a treatment to try to get the cravings and try to get off some of the opioids and heroin.
Yeah. Now, medication-assisted treatment, one of the good things it does is it reduces the cravings, because an addict's biggest opportunity for relapse, I guess, is the cravings.
Yeah.
The phenomenon of craving. You know, I talk to people all the time. What does phenomenon mean? It's undescribable. Nobody knows what it means. But when that craving comes in, if you don't intervene right then and there, it leads to the compulsion to use. I can tell you, for the last 6 months of my using, I did not want to use when I woke up. But I had to use.
Right.
I had to use. I couldn't function.
You were sick, too.
Right. The drug was calling the shots. I wasn't calling the shots. But every night when I went to bed, I'm like, this is it. I'm not doing this again. But the next day, and that phenomenon of craving kicked in because I didn't feel good, and then it just led to the compulsion to use. But it's, and again, I've never been on Suboxone except for that clinic, but from what people tell me is they can wean down, and they get to 1 milligram, and whatever that 1 milligram, and I don't know if it's mental or I'm not sure what it is, but you know, I don't care what drug you're on that you're weaning off of, there's going to be some discomfort.
Yes.
There's going to be some. You're not going to have the full-blown discomfort of full-blown heroin where you lose bodily fluids
Right.
and you're curled up in the corner in a ball. That's horrendous. It's horrendous. But you're going to have some discomfort. You know, the biggest thing is you're not going to sleep. I was in treatment with a guy from South Boston. We were roommates for 17 days. And during the day, you're okay because you're doing groups, you're taking walks, you're associating with other people. And then you go to bed. And that's the worst part. You're just staring at ceiling tiles going,
Thinking.
"Oh, this part sucks." So this kid, Pat, from South Boston, says, he was a heroin addict too. He goes, "Let's read the big book." And I'm like, "Yeah, you read the big book, you know." Big book has a lot of great stuff in it. It's like reading the Bible.
Yes.
And he started reading, and within 5 minutes, I was sound asleep. So I use that tool with people today when they tell me they can't sleep. I'm like, go read the big book. Yep. It eases your mind. It's hard to follow, first of all, because of the language, but it eases your mind. And it does help relax you so you can go to, because you don't sleep for about 3 months if you're an opiate addict. No. It alters everything in your brain so much. Post-acute withdrawal can last up to 2 years, and post-acute withdrawal are the withdrawal symptoms after using. And there's a series of symptoms you're going to go through. I can be very grateful today. The only real symptom I still suffer from is short-term memory loss. But that's fixable. I write things down, you know?
Yes.
I go to conferences. I go to a lot of conferences, and I grab those little notepads with the pen attached to them.
Yep.
And when people tell me, I don't know if I can remember that, I give that out. And I didn't create any of this. I learned all this stuff in recovery. I learned this from people that came before me of how to, work with people. So I got my degree, and I became a counselor. And my first counseling job was at the Meridian House in East Boston.
Yep.
And I'll never forget this. So when I worked at the detox, I worked overnight, so I got overnight pay plus shift differential for Saturday and
I like
Sunday.
working the overnights, huh?
Well, because my kids were young.
Oh, okay.
So, and my wife had a real
Worked,
good job.
She was paying the bills.
She was paying the bills, right? So
I
I would,
worked 11 to 7 for many years.
you have to learn how to do it. You have to learn how to do it, and you can't. You got to make sure you get your sleep no matter what, and get your
Right,
naps in,
right,
or
yep.
you're in trouble. But I was I'm working the overnights, and I was making $13.44 an hour, and I was the guy that gave you your pillows and blankets and wake you up to get your medication. I get my first counseling job. I'm psyched about it. I go to the Meridian House, great facility, therapeutic community, and Kim Hanton says to me, and the pay's $11 an hour. And I went, wait a minute. I just went to school for 4 years. I just got my license. There's something wrong with this picture. I was doing better giving you pillows and blankets. And that's one of the problems with recovery homes, and that's one of the problems they have keeping good help is they don't pay. They don't pay. It's a little better now, but still it's not what it should be.
She's still there.
Kim Hinton's still there. Yes, she is.
I know her very well.
Yep, Kim's a nice lady. So I worked there for a year and just, I couldn't afford to work there anymore. They just, raises at recovery homes are like a quarter. And that's like maybe every 2 years you'll get a quarter. Yeah, it was crazy.
That's sad.
It is. So I learned that if you go to either a penal facility or a medical facility, you're going to make more money because they get more money. So I got a job. I was actually doing an internship, and I got a job at the Brook House over on Park Drive for pre-release for Suffolk County inmates. And I was doing counseling there. The pay was a little bit better. And then from there, I went to the Office of Community Corrections. In the meantime, though, you're always working a second job in this field because $11 an hour don't cut it. So I've worked at the whole continuum of care. I've worked in detoxes, CSSs, TSSs, recovery homes, therapeutic communities, pre-release, and community corrections.
If you have any questions, there you go.
So I went to community corrections, and I worked there for 7 years. And then because I had a bachelor's degree, and when the
Applied for a
probation
PO job,
finally opened up for outsiders to get in, I applied for a probation job. And the funny part is I didn't get any interviews for district court or superior court. I got all probate.
You should, well, in my estimation, you probably should be in district court, although addiction has no boundaries, it's everywhere.
Right.
So.
Well, and you would have thought that with 7 years at OCC, 3 years at the Brook House, but I'm a human service major.
Yeah.
And probate court is more, you're doing more human service work. You're working with families. So I got the opportunity. I got hired by Scott Angelo. He's my chief, and at the Middlesex Probate and Family Court.
Scott, you're lucky. Best PO around. No one has more knowledge.
Well, I got to thank Scott because he gave me an opportunity. So that's how I look at it.
Thank you, Scott. And he helped other probationers in the system because anytime he was, like I said earlier, there was a training, he was teaching it, I put my sneakers on and ran. Wealth of knowledge.
Thank you. One of the things when I was at OCC, they had POICs back then.
Yeah, yep.
And so we'd call the court and say,
Did you work in Suffolk?
Yeah. Yeah, down on Methadone Mile.
With Joyce and was
Oh, yeah.
Richie there?
Richie Wright, Joyce, Dennis Halls, Brian Mirasola.
Name drop. Brian's got a big position.
Yes, he
though.
does now, yes.
Congratulations.
He's a nice
Brian.
kid. Brian's a really nice kid.
He is a nice kid.
So I would call the courts and say, John Doe tested positive for Xanax. Is that an opiate? and I'm not putting POs down.
no.
It's just, you know what? There's a lot to know about addiction.
They're like doctors. They didn't know.
Right. So after that happened a few times, when I got hired in probation, I went to the training academy and I asked Patty Gavin if I could do some trainings. And she gave me an opportunity to go do a half-a-day training out in Westboro. And and after I was done, Diane Richard was there, and she just said, "Yeah, we're just going to stop booking you." So that's what. So for the last 3.5 years, I travel around the state and I do presentations on substance abuse. We just incorporated a new one on fentanyl because fentanyl's such a problem now, and I love doing them. I love doing them.
Caused 85% of the deaths for a while there.
Absolutely. I think the last stats that come out, 90% fentanyl was the primary drug. Heroin is the fourth drug they're finding in toxicology reports. So that just shows you there's not a lot of heroin out there.
And they're lacing it in other drugs now, cocaine,
Everything.
marijuana. I mean,
You can buy a pill press in China for $50,000, and it comes with all the pharmaceutical dyes,
how
to
make it.
change out
Yep.
to
Chemical,
to make it look like pharmaceutical pills. And they're doing that with Xanax,
50,000?
50 for a pill press.
Wow.
But you can make like $1.6 million off 100,000 pills. So it's very profitable if you can get into it. But they're making it is very profitable. But they're making fake Xanax pills that are fentanyl.
On the street, yeah.
Oxycodone pills, Perk 30s, Vicodin pills. And so if you're used to taking 4 or 5 Perk 30s a day, because that's where your tolerance is, and they look, I have slides that I'll show you. I dare you to tell me which is the real one and which is the, you can't. And not only that, but a lot of these deals are in alleys or in cars real quick, and they're close enough. Some of them look spot on, and some of them, if you really look at it, you'd know that it might not be the real drug. But you're used to taking 4 or 5 Perk 30s, and you get 4 or 5 fentanyl.
Fentanyls, you're going.
You're going.
Yep.
You're going.
That's the frightening part now, Kevin. These addicts now, when they're shooting or using opioids, they have no idea what they're taking. And that's why we're losing thousands of people a day. I mean, hundreds of people a day, and up to 72,000 last year.
That's right.
And, I've seen
Nationwide.
statistics, they're coming down somewhat. And I think you've mentioned it, Jones, because of the Narcan.
Because of Narcan.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's in 2018, because I have slides on this. There was over 20,000 Narcan administrations, just with first responders in Massachusetts.
20,000.
Over 20,000. It's like over 5,000 a quarter. Because all this information you can get from Department of Public Health. Department of Public Health does an unbelievable job with updating information and pamphlets. They came out with a program where, back in our day, you didn't talk about drugs.
Nope.
You just didn't. You didn't talk about sex in our day because, and I remember.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, I remember a girl got pregnant in our class. We never saw her again. I don't know where they brought them, but they just because you didn't talk about that, and
It's in the closet.
she was somewhere. But you didn't talk about drugs either. So DPH came out with pamphlets, age-appropriate pamphlets. So 8 to 10-year-olds, you're talking to them about caffeine and nicotine. 11 to 13, marijuana and alcohol. 14 to 16, maybe the pills, and then over 16, then you get into the hardcore opiates, because some parents are afraid to talk to their kids.
Oh, yes.
And you don't talk to a 10-year-old about heroin addiction.
No.
Because that's just not going to work.
Marijuana.
Right. Well, 10-year-olds, marijuana or caffeine, nicotine.
What's your unofficial opinion on legalization of marijuana?
In my
Recreational, I'm not talking medicinal.
Yep. My personal opinion is alcohol is the worst drug on the market.
Yep.
I think marijuana is a safer option. For me, I can't do anything, but alcohol destroys the human body. Every year there's over 88,000 alcohol-related deaths in this country, but it's legal, it's social, so...
Social norm.
Yeah. So I don't know anyone that robbed a bank on marijuana. I know people, alcohol lowers your inhibition so much, you'll do anything. So personally, I'm abstinent from everything, but I think it's a safer option than alcohol.
I slightly disagree, but that'll be a discussion for another day. For me, I agree, alcohol is brutal, but I think marijuana can be, and I would almost lump it in that gateway drug, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, it always has been. Alcohol and marijuana have always been that. And you know, the marijuana today is not the marijuana we grew up on.
The THC is much stronger.
If we got 2% THC, we scored.
30, 40 now.
Oh yeah, and if they dab or wax it,
Yep.
where they
Wax it.
they put it in a colander and they take, remember the old butane lighter fluid with the old cigarette lighters? They pour that over the marijuana, and there's a cookie sheet on the underneath it, and it sucks all the THC out of the leaves, and it's like this brown wax, and you scoop it up and put it in the vape pens or whatever, and that can become 80 to 100% THC.
Well, they're still lacing marijuana with fentanyl now too, right?
Yes, they are. Yep, fentanyls and everything.
Dangerous.
So I went to a DEA training, and the instructor said that Lawrence, Massachusetts is the source city of fentanyl in the
yes.
country. It's not New York, it's not LA, in the country. So whatever the pipeline is there,
Yep.
and they make 2 raids a day in Lawrence looking for fentanyl. So, you know, people say,
So I don't want to live there.
no, people say, why would drug dealers or drug cartels want a drug so powerful that it kills people? Well, a kilo of fentanyl is $3,000. A kilo of heroin is probably $50,000. You can gain a lot more customers. So you gain 1,000 customers, you lose 200.
Capital is to get more people using it.
Right. You can buy a finger, which is 10 grams of fentanyl, for $200 to $400 in Lawrence, $350 to $550 up in Manchester. The further north you go, a little bit more. But you can make a lot of money off of a finger of fentanyl. And, you know, back in our day, you know, everything was in a baggie, and it's hard to conceal. These things look like little candles. They're this big when they end up pressing them all together.
Yep.
And they're easy to conceal, and it's easy to get around and distribute. But yeah, fentanyl
When did
is
fentanyl start finding its way in heroin?
2015.
So about 4 years ago.
Yep, and it started in Ohio. A DEA agent in Ohio started to see it in Ohio. Because for many,
Filler, like put it as a filler, right?
right, I can remember back in the 80s, people were overdosing from heroin laced with fentanyl. And people were afraid of it. They're like, that stuff's going to kill you. Someone had a batch of it, and a bunch of people died, and then you really didn't see it again. But if you look at the CDC statistics on it, from 2000 to 2015, there was probably 400 or 500 fentanyl seizures a year. In 2015, that started to rise. In 2017, there were over 14,000 fentanyl seizures. Massachusetts is number 2 in the country
In fentanyl.
in fentanyl seizures. There were 620 fentanyl seizures in Massachusetts. Only Ohio had more. So fentanyl is now the primary drug of in the market today. It's a real and
It's a killer.
the problem with it is, well, it's powerful. It's made in labs in China and shipped into the United States.
Not in Mexico, just China.
Well, no, it goes from China to Mexico. Yeah, everything goes through Mexico. Everything. 90% of the heroin comes from Afghanistan to Mexico, and then and some of it comes in through Canada, because Canada is easy to get it in. It's so sparse up there, the borders. It's easy to get in. But it's made in labs in China. They ship it in. They mix it up. But the DEA did this. They had 3 blenders in their lab, and because they're mixing it in blenders, which blenders don't mix liquids all that great. Never mind powders.
Right.
And so they were using flour, and they put some food coloring in to see how it blends up. So the bottom part blends up okay. The middle, not so much. The top doesn't get touched. And that's the problem with fentanyl, is you don't know where you're getting. You don't know if you're getting the top, the middle, or the bottom. And so you could be getting 100% pure fentanyl and not even know it. One of the big concerns nowadays, though, from people I talk to, is people are actually seeking fentanyl. They're not even looking for heroin. They are going out and asking for fentanyl. And I understand that mentality, because when I was using heroin, I remember if someone OD'd, most people would be like, stay away from that. The addict mind says, where do you get it?
Right.
We want to, because our thinking is we'll do half of what they did.
Right.
And that way, you know, you really only get high the first time, and then you're chasing it after that. So you're always chasing that pinnacle, that first rush and that first high you get.
Best, they claim the best high.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so when you hear some really good stuff, in an addict's mind now, and addicts don't think normal, that will get me that real good first high that I ever got. But a lot of times it's too powerful, and it just takes people out.
How long did it take you, once you became clean, the brain chemistry to really function and heal?
Oh, it's still functioning and healing.
Wow. Is it usually like 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, usually 2 years.
2 years.
That's what post-acute withdrawal is. It's when all the chemical levels and the pathways are getting back to normal, the serotonin levels, the dopamine levels. And that's why if you used for long-term, you need long-term treatment.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, they think they go to detox.
yeah,
right?
and the
14 days.
detox isn't treatment.
It's not treatment.
No, it's the medical process of detoxifying the body of toxins. That's what it is. Treatment starts when you go on to the next phase.
Right.
And one of the other problems with some of the people that go through treatment now, so they might do a detox and go to a CSS or a TSS and then go to recovery home. So they got 9 months, they're feeling good, they got a decent job, you know, they're back home, things are going good, and they think that's what I completed treatment.
They have they get amnesia. They forget.
You never complete treatment. You complete treatment when they bury you.
Yep.
You know, and AA, NA, Smart Recovery, whatever it is you're doing, that's the continuum of care once you get out of a residential facility. You have to, it's a daily reprieve. That's all we get is a daily
It's a
reprieve.
lifelong battle. You got to continue in treatment.
And you know something, it is, but when you're dealing with a 25-year-old kid, he's like, the rest of my life, I can never drink again. I can never.
You can live.
But what I tell them is, no, I didn't tell you that. You can't use today.
Right. You only
That's
have
where the
today.
one day at a
That's right.
time comes
Yep.
from. You just can't use today. Really? And I go, yeah. And then we'll talk about tomorrow. But if you try to look at it globally, like, oh my God, I'm 25 and I can never, because I had that mentality. I always thought I could at least drink till I'm 40, because my father was 40 when I started drinking. And so I should be good till I'm 40. I lasted about a year, and I was a full-blown blackout alcoholic. So that's one of the problems today is it's hard work.
It is.
The hardest thing I ever did in my life was to get clean and stay. I had stopped many times. I couldn't stay stopped.
Can you also talk a little bit about how the disease is progressive, too?
Yep. You know, I used to drink normal. But again, something switched in my brain, and not only does your tolerance go up, but then you hit a peak where you do reverse tolerance, but it also, the progression of your behavior changes, because addiction's all about behavior.
Yep.
I used to drink at nice places, and I ended up at dives. Because, you know, water seeks its own level. And the beers at the nice places are $5, and the beers at the dumps are $1. And I was all about quantity. So, but it's the same, reversing the process it's a process to get back to a normal state of being. And it can take up to 2 years. Some people, it might take a little longer, depending on how long you used, the quantity you used. And if you don't recognize what you're going to experience over those 2 years, you know, memory loss is a big one. Emotions. I had no emotions. I really didn't care about anybody. And I'll never forget when this happened to me. I had about 3-4 months, and I was watching Lassie. Remember the show Lassie?
Yes.
Timmy was lost. And Lassie, they were asking Lassie to go find. I started crying like a baby. I totally lost control of my emotions. And that went on for a long period of time. And so if you're not prepared for that, you think something else is going on, because you're starting to feel now.
Right.
And I didn't want to feel. I used because I didn't want to feel. Addicts and alcoholics use because they don't like the way they feel. They want to feel different, bottom line. And if you don't know that's coming, then you're like, I don't understand this. And it leads to relapse. Self-care is, they say resentment's the #1 cause of relapse, which it plays a big part in it, but self-care is actually the biggest part. If you don't take care of yourself and you put other things ahead of your recovery, you're going to lose it anyway. My meetings are I have to do what I do,
It's your medicine.
It is. Yeah, there's no pill, there's no shot, there's no liquid, I have to do. I've been going to a men's meeting in Brighton probably 14 years. It's my staple meeting. It's an unbelievable meeting. 70 men talking about men's stuff. I'm not going to meetings to look for my 4th ex-wife, But it happens. No, it happens a lot. And the theory behind it is we'll keep each other clean, but what really happens is they relapse together because they take the focus off the recovery. That's why they say no major changes the first year, no relationships the first year. Focus on yourself. But I go to this meeting and I hardly ever miss it. I run a barbecue for the group every summer. It's coming.
So you're the chef, you're on the grill?
I purchase all the stuff. I mean, the donations, we collect money and I go out and get all the stuff and then set it all up and do a little cooking and whatever. But it's an opportunity to meet families now.
Right.
To meet the other halves or the kids instead of just the people we deal with every Sunday. I maybe have missed that meeting 5 times in the last 14 years because I was out of the country. I'll get 5 texts or phone calls if I miss that meeting.
Worried, people are worried about you.
Yeah, you all right? You never miss this meeting. What's going on? I can tell you this, nobody from the VFW in Burlington, Mass. has called me in the last 40 years to ask me if I'm all right. But I guarantee if I walked in there today, they would never know I was gone. Because that's what alcoholism does.
Right.
It's the same routine.
Yep,
It's like,
yep.
oh yeah, hey, how was work today? Because they're pickled.
They are pickled.
Um,
You've been quiet tonight.
I know. I'm absorbing it.
okay, that's cool. But yeah,
You know what? We got 4 minutes.
really.
4 minutes.
Wow.
Wow.
And you actually,
You got to get him on again.
I know.
As
Any-
long as this chief allows him,
Yep.
I'll come on because I'm a retired probation officer, so I can.
He's my co-host.
Oh,
Oh, I'll be glad to come back. I love doing this stuff. I heard the expression in recovery early on, you got to give it away to keep it.
yep.
And being an addict, you don't give nothing away. You take.
Yes.
And I'm like, how does that work? But what I've come to recognize is the more I give back, the less I'm in my own head. Because I can still get in my own head and still have crazy thoughts. As long as
It's like a battlefield.
it
right?
is. Oh, some days it is, yeah.
Yeah.
But as long as they're only thoughts and not actions, I'm okay.
Yeah.
But that's why sponsorship is important. That's why the community with other people is important. There's been days I've had to call 4 or 5 people before I even get to work because I just wake up and I have these crazy thoughts
yeah.
and I need someone else to tell me, yeah, that's not normal.
I would tell my probation is, if they'd come in like you with the crazy thoughts and they were backsliding I'd say, your medicine's the meeting. Go to a meeting. Go every day. Even if you're not getting out of it, listen to one thing. Something's going to trigger you.
Absolutely. You go to meetings long enough, you're going to hear your story.
Yes.
And I didn't always like going to meetings, but now it's my hour and a half of escape from society. Because life doesn't stop. Life is still crazy. People are still crazy.
It's crazy, yeah.
Yeah, it is getting worse. But it's my hour and a half to just,
Sanity.
it's my time.
Yeah.
It's my time to take care of me. And I have to take care of me because I've tried it the other way. It doesn't work.
But because of that, you've seen now where you have relationships with your family again.
Oh, yeah.
You have,
Oh, yeah.
you have a job, you're an expert in addiction.
I'm not an expert.
Yeah, you are.
I know more than most, but I'm not an expert.
I consider you one. I could have learned a lot from you.
Call me anytime.
I will.
Yeah.
She has done terrific work, too, for our community.
I try.
Yeah. Oh, that's all we can do.
This is my therapy.
Yep. That's
We have
all
to
we
say
can do.
goodnight. We have 45 seconds.
Okay.
but
Thank you,
just
Kevin. I
wanna
appreciate
Thank
for
you.
coming in.
Thank you.
And I feel that what I do here helps me
Mm-hmm.
because if I'm home and alone, I think.
Absolutely.
I think about my son. I think about, it's not that I didn't help him, I tried.
Right.
And unfortunately, I have to sit back and you'd like to just shake them and say,
Yep.
come on, you're not doing that anymore.
Right. Yep. My sponsor
have no
says,
control over
this is a danger zone. I have to stay out of my head.
Battlefield.
It is. It's a danger zone. And when I'm out helping other people, I'm not thinking about me.
Right.
Because we're self-centered by nature.
Get out of
Addicts are.
yourself.
Yep. So,
Thank
but thank you for having me on.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank
They
you.
haven't shut us off yet, but that's good. But I'm actually going to go out and tell Stuart to shut off the YouTube. But you can watch it. You know, you can go on
Yeah,
YouTube.
no, I
Be
will.
back on, yeah, you can watch it. Was it come back on in a couple of days?
No, it's by tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay.
You'll be able to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it plays quite a few times during the week. I was here one day and I was watching my show.
Yeah, 'cause it's on a local cable.
Oh, yeah.
So they repeat it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we added the YouTube to it to make it so that other people can see it as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also go under www.somervillemedia.org and you can see the previous show.
Oh, yeah. Oh, cool.
That'll be like tomorrow
Yep.
when Dave adds it to the, whatever they call it.
Yeah.
Can't think
The agenda or whatever.
This is like HBO now, Bill Maher after hours.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that we're still
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, no, thank you.
gonna take.
That was-
God, it was, yeah, you need to talk.
so he-
Yeah, that's fine.
No, he's, you know what? He, yeah, but I will say this.
We're still on YouTube.